Paisley Currah, a professor of political science and women's and gender studies at Brooklyn College and the CUNY Graduate Center, has an interesting take on why the government has a stake in defining people's sexual identity. It has less to do with moral or religious beliefs about sexuality, he argues, and more to do with deciding who does or doesn't get certain benefits. But is even that changing? His new book, Sex Is as Sex Does: Governing Transgender Identity, is published by New York University Press. Welcome.
Thank you.
Over the last few decades, the variety of gender identities that the public has been exposed to has expanded greatly. While once people were either male or female, gay or lesbian, or straight or bisexual, now you can be a transgender male, a transgender female, cisgender, binary, non-binary. I even read that there are actually more than 70 acknowledged gender categories aside from male and female. Do you understand why some people are confused by all of this?
Oh, for sure, because we think of, when we grow up, we're told there's like two genders or two sexes, male and female, and that's just kind of the long-standing kind of common sense wisdom. But that common sense wisdom doesn't really reflect how people inhabit gender or live with their gender, and there's been this kind of flourishing of language and thought and discourse about gender that gives people more finely tuned language to express who they really are. So now, the very common categories are male, female, and non-binary. And so non-binary is sometimes emerging as a kind of catch-all category for people who don't fit, whose gender identity is not always male or not always female, but is sometimes in between.
Your book looks specifically at how the state, meaning different government agencies, legislatures, the courts, classify people by gender, or allows people to classify themselves by gender. What did you hope to achieve by writing this book?
Well, I had been working in the area of transgender rights for, a couple of decades. I had been a transgender rights advocate and doing transgender studies, and I founded a transgender studies journal and worked at the city and the state and the federal level to pass trans rights legislation. And then I decided I wanted to step back a little bit and just figure out at a more deeper level what's going on. So the problem that really interested me was this situation where someone like me, a transgender person, a transgender man, I might have an M for male on my driver's license, but be classified as an F for marriage or be sent to a women's prison. So I was trying to understand, how could the government classify people differently? Say
different agencies, different
and it turns
government
out,
energy.
Right, exactly. So from a transgender person's perspective, that's unfair and unjust, which is true. But I wanted to kind of understand from the state's perspective, why do they have these different criteria for deciding who's male and who's female?
Why the title, Sex Is as Sex Does?
That's a good question. So as an advocate, I spent a lot of time saying, talking with New York City officials or state officials about how to classify people's gender. And we'd say gender should really be based on, gender identity. And this is the ideal definition of gender, and one's sexual characteristics kind of fall under the category of gender. So we were always arguing about some ideal, perfect definition, which is important to talk about. But over time, I realized the bureaucrats weren't thinking about some ideal, perfect definition of what sex really is. They were thinking about what it does, how it functions in government. So sex is different in incarceration institutions than in marriage than in driver's license bureaus.
Lately, there's been a flurry of state legislation aimed at prohibiting trans people from, accessing public restrooms that don't correspond to their assigned sex, gender at birth, banning trans students from participating in sports aligned with their gender identities, outlawing classroom discussions of gender and sexual identity altogether. Why is this happening now?
Right, I think that's a really good question, because what most of my book talks about is how sex classification was kind of the domain of bureaucrats, and now sex classification and transgender issues have been kind of punted into the overt political sphere where legislators are talking about it. In previous decades, legislators would have no idea what was going on in their government in terms of sex classification, and now they really are paying attention. And I think that gender is being sort of weaponized in the cultural wars to stoke the base, because you mentioned in your introduction that there's a significant element of the population that is against transgender people or transgender rights. And what some people who study public opinion have found is public opinion was getting better and better and better on transgender rights, and now it's diverging. It's becoming more partisan, and that is a result of Republican messaging around transgender people as being some sort of threat to the nation.
Sort of a political backlash.
It's a backlash.
Right.
Yeah.
A major goal of transgender activism is to allow changes to government identification documents to conform to a person's current gender identity. So what kinds of documents are we talking about, and why is being able to change them so important?
Yeah, it's really important to kind of function in society. Like about 20 years ago, a trans woman testified at a New York City Council hearing about a trans rights bill that I had helped author. And she had the most perfect quote. She said, "I don't suffer from gender dysphoria. I suffer from bureaucratic dysphoria. Every time I try to write a check or present my ID, my identity does not match my appearance, and I'm like stopped in wanting to doing what I want to do. So whether it be getting a plane ticket, going through security, the TSA, applying for a loan, all these kind of things, like your identity documents like list your gender, and it becomes a problem for transgender people who don't have an accurate representation of that."
In fact, having an accurate document is a basic condition of doing politics, of being out in the world.
Absolutely.
In New York City, there's obviously been a movement towards some greater acceptance of transgender people, and towards making it easier to legally change one's gender identity on government documents. In New York City, 20 years ago, for instance, a person who wanted to change the gender on their birth certificate had to go through all these things, show they had undergone hormone therapy, gender assignment surgery, a psychiatric examination, affidavits from doctors. Now, all they have to do is to submit their own affidavit indicating that they are either F, M, or X. But you can't do that in most other states, right?
Well, a lot of states are changing their policies. So that's where birth certificates. New York State has also changed its policies around driver's license. So almost all states, all driver's license and almost all states would let people change their sex classification, but many put up barriers that are real obstacles for people in terms of requiring certain kinds of surgeries that a lot of transgender people don't have. So, but now we're seeing a little bit of a division between what we might think of as like red states and blue states, where liberal jurisdictions, progressive jurisdictions say, yeah, you can change your gender classification, that's not a problem. And more redder states are more likely to have more barriers. And this is more of a recent phenomenon in terms of making it more difficult.
Yeah. Tell me about birth certificates in particular, and what states are doing in regard to that.
Yeah, so for a long time there has been a lot of move towards reforming birth certificates. So like, for example, New York City, which for some historical reason is its own jurisdiction for birth certificates. Normally they're state documents.
Right.
New York City is special and New York State does the rest of it. Has changed its policy many times in the last 50 years, and now we have this policy where, yeah, as you said, you just say M or F or X, and that's moving forward. And many states have moved towards that policy. It's super important, but there are some states that, as reform was beginning to happen, transgender issues became politicized, and that has sort of ground to a halt. Like the bureaucrats in the state offices that are working on making life easier for transgender people, we're changing these policies, and now we have something like the legislature of Oklahoma passing a law that says no one in Oklahoma will ever have an X on their birth certificate. And this never used to be the domain of legislators.
Yeah.
They would just leave that to the experts in their administration and not politicize transgender people's identity.
Right. As we said earlier, the state's interest in maintaining certain gender classification it's partly a function of some religious beliefs and some moral beliefs, but it's also done for practical reasons. And I think you wrote that the establishment of gender is a mechanism for distributing rights and resources. In other words, designating some citizens male and others females allows the government to bestow rights and resources on some and not on others. That it's about, letting states do what they want to do, or state agencies do what they are charged with doing.
Transgender rights movement kind of presents itself as like this autonomous identity politics movement, like First, there's the civil rights movement, then there's feminism, there's gay rights and transgender rights movement. But in fact, the gains of the transgender rights movement are really related to the gains of feminism. So as feminists fought to stop the state from discriminating against women, the lowering of ending state discrimination against women has kind of lowered the stakes and made it more possible for transgender people to change their birth certificates, because sex classification is baked into government, not to hurt transgender people intentionally, but to make sure men got more stuff than women most of the time. I mean, selective service is one disadvantage for men. And so transgender people come along and accidentally bump into that system that doesn't really fit who we are. But the more gains that feminism made, the more possibilities there were for transgender people to change our sex classification.
Talk about how some of the different state agencies use, different ways that they use gender classification. I mean, it would be different. There's, the health department with birth certificates. Department of Motor Vehicles probably would have a different motivation. Divorce courts might have a different motivation. Public housing, immigration.
Sure, exactly. So when I was working on the birth certificate policy in New York City in the early part of the 20th century, we thought we could just change the birth certificate policy to a good policy. But the Department of Health shopped it around to all the other city agencies, and every agency had a different take on what the proper definition of sex was. So that's when I started to kind of really think through the major ideas for this book and realize that, like, the Department of Motor Vehicles in New York State, for example, has a pretty good policy. And I, as an activist and an advocate, I think, oh, that's good. They're not being transphobic. They're not hating on transgender people. But in fact, their policy exists because it furthers the state interests. So if I'm a transgender man and I'm getting pulled over by a police officer, it doesn't further the interest of New York State for me to hand over an identity document that says M or F on it. You know what I mean? Because I just don't look like an F. So in terms of the state's interest in kind of keeping track of bodies moving through territory and having an identity card that looks like you, it's in the state's interest to make it possible for me to change my sex classification. Right. But then I would be looking at other areas, and for example, marriage was a big one when there was still a ban on same-sex marriage. And transgender people who had changed all their identity documents, still for the purposes of marriage, when it was challenged in the courts would say, oh, your sex is assigned at birth, literally. And it was always because it was in the state's interest to deny access to resources to trans people. So, because marriage isn't just a romantic institution, it's about the distribution of benefits.
Right.
So property cases, custody cases, whether there was a woman in Texas named Christy Lee Littleton, her husband died in a hospital, she wanted to sue the hospital for malpractice, and the hospital's insurance lawyers said, oh wait, she's a trans woman, therefore she was assigned male at birth, therefore she still is a man, therefore her marriage is a same-sex marriage, therefore it's not a valid legal marriage, therefore she has no right to sue. Yeah. So when money's involved, it often went against transgender people.
Driver's licenses in New York. What can you...
Oh, driver's license in New York, you can basically say you're M, you're F, or X.
Okay.
And that was changed a couple of years ago with legislation. So that's it's one of the best policies. I think there's like 18 or 20 jurisdictions that let people have X on their driver's license.
What does X mean?
X means non-binary.
Okay,
yeah.
okay.
M, F, or X, yeah.
You argue that it should not be the state's business to police the relationship between people's sex assigned at birth, their gender identity and gender expression.
Mm-hmm. Well, and that is traditionally what has happened. Like going back to like cross-dressing laws and dress codes laws, where like people had to wear a certain number of articles of the clothing associated with their sex, or there has always... Yes, yes. People would get arrested for cross-dressing if they're not wearing like at least three, like someone who was assigned male at birth had to be wearing at least 3 items of men's clothing. So there's lots of really good historical work on cross-dressing laws. So there's always been this regulation of sex and the relationship between assigned sex at birth and one's gender presentation. And now we're moving into an era where that is really much less policed. But with the new Republican kind of weaponization of transgender issues, we're seeing that come back into play, where legislators in like Florida and other places are saying, school kids can't just change their pronoun, or school kids can't just change their name, or school kids have to wear clothes associated with their sex assigned at birth. They're going back into kind of policing gender.
Tell me about your experience as a transgender man over time, and what that was like, and if you feel things have gotten better.
Well, I feel like, yes, things have definitely gotten better. And, I live in New York City. I live in New York State, so I teach at the City University of New York. I have tenure. I'm a full professor. I'm white. I'm upper middle class. I have almost, I'm binary looking. People think I'm cisgender. I have my baldness, which seems to establish my maleness. So I have all those kinds of privileges, and even with all those kinds of privileges, I still kind of get nervous, when I go fly, and I have to go through the scanner machines. So if you think about like someone like me moving through the world without that kind of privilege, and then take away that privilege and think about folks who are often assumed to be suspect because they don't have the same kind of class status or because of kind of racialized norms of surveilling people in stores and so on. Like it puts trans people in a very kind of vulnerable position. But I've certainly seen a lot of changes to the positive in New York State. I think I started the book with a story like 20 years ago where in a Toys R Us, which is now defunct, out in Bay Ridge, Brooklyn, like 3 trans women were literally chased out of the store by employees wielding baseball bats because their very presence in the store was just considered insane. And now we wouldn't have a retailer supporting that kind of treatment of transgender customers.
It might still happen, but
yeah.
but
they wouldn't go to court defending it to the death. That's right. Yeah.
State legislatures, public schools, colleges, and professional sports continue to grapple with whether trans people should be allowed to compete on sports teams that have historically been restricted to cisgender individuals. And in recent years, the restroom issue has once again reared its ugly head. More than a dozen states and the U.S. Congress restrict the use of public restrooms by trans people to those designated for the gender they were assigned at birth. Is the current rash of restrictions on transgender people a backlash against a growing transgender rights movement? And if so, how is this movement likely to fare under a Trump administration? Here to give us some insights into these issues is Red Washburn, professor of English and Women and Gender Studies at Kingsborough Community College and the CUNY Graduate Center. Welcome. I talked about all the states that have banned gender-affirming therapy for transgender youth. How big a problem is that? Is that a really onerous thing for young transgender youth?
For me, any kind of issue connected to healthcare for anybody, not just trans youth, is extremely essential for survival. For trans youth in particular, I think it's a matter of them probably like not killing themselves because they need to have things that validate who they are. Bullying in schools has always been a problem, and without healthcare and without a recognition that they have a right to exist and to be who they are, it becomes a serious mental health issue for people. In general, LGBTQ plus people have higher rates of anxiety and depression than cisgender and heterosexual people. And I think this is true for any marginalized person, people experiencing interlocking oppressions such as racism, classism, homophobia, transphobia, all these different issues. Youth should be able to make decisions about their bodies. It's an autonomy decision for me. So I think about myself, I've always been gender nonconforming, and had I had access to healthcare, I probably would have done things to preserve my neck instead of like binding. I probably would have had top surgery earlier. So I think it does take a toll on certain people's bodies depending on how they're presenting themselves and how they're choosing to live their lives.
So what will happen if the Supreme Court upholds these restrictions?
I mean, I think a lot of people are going to really suffer mentally and physically. I think a lot of people are going to be killed or they're going to kill themselves. I think part of the issue for me is about somebody is making a decision that is not the person. It's a politician in this case. And I always feel like this should be a decision that is chosen by children, their parents or guardians, their doctors, the people who are experts in their lives and in their bodies, not politicians.
Transgender participation in sports is a huge issue, especially regarding transgender females who want to compete on girls' sports teams. And Where does Title IX come down on transgender girls playing on girls' teams?
I mean, I think for me, this is also an issue of, do you want someone to participate in life? I mean, do you want someone to participate in activities that will help not just them, but also the society in which they live? Sports are a really good way to relieve stress, to produce community, to deny access to the right to be involved in that is discrimination. And for me, that's just an issue of not just self-determination to participate in the way that you want to as a human being, but also just to be, cherished and recognized, to be a part of that community.
How about the fairness issue? Where you have daughters who are participating on the high school soccer team, and along comes a transgender young woman, who wants to compete. And I guess the concern is that it sets up an unfair kind of competition. I mean, that seems to be the big argument. Mm-hmm. How do you respond to that?
I mean, I think that the larger question that I have is around fairness for whom? Because, okay, if I use myself as an example, I have had high testosterone my whole life. I have polycystic ovaries. I probably have more testosterone than some boys. And, I had a beard before I had a beard. I just shaved it every day. And did that put me at an unfair advantage to playing women's sports, which I used to. I used to play basketball. I used to play softball. I used to be mad that I had to play softball because I wanted to play baseball because my hands are small and I wanted a smaller ball. But I think that, the biology question is tricky because we have to look at the social meanings attached to them. And I would argue that trans women probably have higher estrogen than most girls because they're taking hormones. And I'm not sure that puts them at an unfair advantage. And I think the larger issue is how do we imagine recreation in a way that is more gender expansive?
The bathroom issue. The bathroom issue always seems to come up when you're talking about gender discrimination. It came up when you're talking about integrating women into the armed services and the male military academies, when we're talking about integrating women into formerly men's colleges. And 12 states have passed bans on transgender females using girls' bathrooms in public schools. So what's with the bathrooms? Why are people get so emotional about bathrooms?
I don't know. I mean, I think just let people go to the bathroom. I joke about this in my classes because people always want to talk about bathrooms. I'm like, can we talk about a utopia instead? Can we talk about a new world? But bathrooms are important. People need to go to the bathroom. Denying people access to the bathroom causes all kinds of health problems, including all kinds of kidney problems. I know so many.
Well, they're not denying access to the bathroom, but they're denying access to certain bathrooms.
Right, but what happens is trans people don't go to the bathroom then. We hold it in, and it hurts our kidneys, and then we develop all kinds of health issues. People talk about tranny bladder, holding your bladder when you're in the public sphere. And
so if you're the principal of a New York City high school, what would be your preferred policy regarding transgenders and bathrooms?
I would put up a sign on the doors that had urinals or stalls, and people could choose what they needed to use, and I would make all the bathrooms available to everybody so they could just go to the bathroom. If trans people are forced to go into a bathroom for them assigned by their sex birth, then they're not going to go to the bathroom, or they're probably going to get bullied, especially trans femmes, trans women in particular, who don't pass. I pass as a transgender man, and I could go to the bathroom. When I wasn't on hormones, I wouldn't use the men's room. When I went to the women's room, people would call security on me all the time.
Yeah. The transgender rights movement. Can you give me some sense of how big a movement is and how it's being conducted?
Most social movements in this country have been intersectional by nature. So, for instance, there have always been trans people involved in civil rights struggles and feminist struggles. The feminist movement has really helped the gains of LGBT struggles. So that, there people have the anti-war movement, the prison abolition movement. There's been tons of trans people in those movements. But I think when people talk about like a trans movement, this is something that in the mainstream discourse seems new, but it actually hasn't been. It's just been imagined differently. You had mentioned the number of bills that have come up, and like for instance, in 2021, I think there was about 100 plus bills around trans healthcare, bathrooms, sports, and now there's like over 600. So like, what is the recent increase? For me, it's like somewhat similar to like, has crime increased? Why are there so many people incarcerated, right? Or is it that we're repressing people more? Are police repressing people more?
Some states have banned public schools from even talking about homosexuality, transgender issues, diversity, race in the classroom. What do you want to say about that?
I think it's deeply unjust. I mean, I was just talking to a colleague about what's going to happen to critical race studies, what's going to happen to LGBTQ studies. The National Women's Studies Association is already putting out statements to defend the state of the field. When I was the editor of WSQ, we did a whole issue on 50 years of women and gender studies, and we're not going back. We're not going back to an academy that doesn't have those things. We're not going back to an education system that doesn't have those things. I think that it might get to the point where things are defunded, but like anything else, we're going to keep doing this work because we have no other choice. I think about this even with my own work. Like, I'm working on a book now that's on trans and non-binary literature, performance and art, and I'm teaching a class here at the Grad Center. I'm thinking about, like, are they just gonna like burn that book when it comes out? Are they going to cancel this class? No, we're gonna keep doing this work because we don't have a choice. So I think at this point, for instance, people are really, really like, adamant about reducing hate crimes. Hate crimes have gone up in New York City, particularly, with BIPOC trans femmes. And every day they have, the Trans Day of Remembrance for all these people who were murdered. There's a lot going on still around prisons and like, the number of trans people who are in prison because they can't find work and they have to do things that, are quote unquote illegal to survive.
And who I would think would be in some physical danger.
And physical danger, yeah, of course, yeah. They're putting their lives at risk doing the work that they're doing. I think there's a lot of issues that are happening now, particularly around connections that I think are really interesting around the intersections of trans and feminist communities around reproductive health care and also trans health care. This larger issue around having access to your body.
I'm afraid we're out of time. I'd like to thank Red Washburn, Professor of English and Women and Gender Studies at Kingsborough Community College and the CUNY Graduate Center, for joining me today. To learn about our upcoming shows, you can follow us on Instagram at One2One CUNY TV. And you can watch the show on the go by downloading the CUNY TV app. For the City University of New York and One2One, I'm Cheryl McCarthy.